Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project. And thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And boy, do we have a guest for you today. Her name is Megan Connor. She is a mother, author, coach, and survivor. She's the author of two books, one titled, I Walked Through Fire to Get Here, and the other is 100 Ways to Practice Self-Care, Meaningful Ways to Relax, De-Stress, and Prioritize Your Mental Health. And we could all use a little bit of that right now. Megan is also the mother of 6 spectacular human beings and a breaker of generational trauma cycles. She was trafficked in a child pornography ring from the age of 7 to 11 and spent almost 40 years in abusive relationships before finally learning how to break free. She now helps others recover from trauma and heal their relationship with themselves. Megan, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
What a story you have. So I'm just going to turn it over to you and ask you to share your story with the listeners.
Okay. So yes, as you said in my bio, I was trafficked when I was a young child. And it was a situation where there was a babysitter in our neighborhood who trafficked many of the kids that they babysat. And my childhood psyche did a really good job of protecting my memory from those things. I really only had fragmented memories of it for a very long time. But I also had an emotionally neglectful family of origin, a very strict religious upbringing. And I think that added to some of the toxicity of the things that I went through in my childhood. And so what became familiar to me was to be neglected, to be ignored, to have my feelings invalidated. And so then when I left my family of origin, I sought out things that felt familiar to me, like we all do. We sort of repeat these patterns in our lives. And so I ended up in abusive situations, ultimately an emotionally and physically abusive marriage. And it wasn't until my body started to speak up about my trauma that I was finally able to address the reality of my childhood and my growing up. And so I started having panic attacks and I was incredibly depressed. I cried all the time. I couldn't get out of bed. And it wasn't until I got to that point that I was finally able to reach out for some therapeutic help. And I chose a therapist who was not affiliated with my religion for the first time in my life. And that really started me on the path to healing. And that journey allowed me to finally start removing things from my life that felt abusive or oppressive. And so I ended up going no contact with my family for a time, with certain members of my family. I ended up getting divorced. I left my teaching career. I left my religion. And I started gradually adding things back into my life that felt healing to me. And I gradually started developing relationships with chosen family and having better relationships with my children, so that now I really am in a very peaceful place with who I am as an individual. And I have a successful career and a very successful primary relationship. My relationships with my kids have never been better. I'm in a really good place. And the reason that I wrote my book, the first book, was because I wanted other people who had experienced trauma in their life and traumatic cycles to know that it was possible not only to heal from those things, but to really thrive and have a beautiful and happy life afterwards.
Wow. So as you were going through this transformation and healing process, you were still at that point, did you have 6 children at the time?
Yes, I did.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So, and you hadn't left your teaching job. So you're going through this incredible transformation, this incredible healing process, which is not really that easy. I mean, it can be very painful and very difficult. And you're managing to hold a full-time teaching job and you have 6 children that you're taking care of at the same time.
Yeah. So I started therapy in that situation, and I very quickly realized that I had a lot more trauma than
Mhm.
I originally thought that I did. I had a lot more to work through than I thought I did because more memories started coming back up the more that
Mhm.
I remembered all of these layers, peeling away all these layers, and things would come to the surface. And so I really came to the conclusion that I was going to need to be institutionalized. I really felt like it was that bad, and I felt like I was going to need that much help. And so I started looking for places that I could check myself into over the summer, because I was like, well,
Mhm.
I'll have a break over the summer. I'll use it to, to go to an institution and really get healed. I, at the time, had no idea what I would do with my kids during that time. So I was just researching, and I actually came across a center that did an intensive outpatient therapy.
Mm.
And so that's what I ended up enrolling in. And I did do it over the summer, and it was 9 hours of therapeutic work a week,
Oh,
and
wow.
3 hours of meditative work, and then another hour with my personal therapist. So those 9 hours were group therapy. It was Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 3 hours, and each one of the hours was led by a therapist that specialized in different things.
Mhm.
And that was really where the most intense part of my healing really took place, because I was in a setting with other women who had been through traumatic experiences. And
Mm.
there was something about speaking out loud about what I'd been through that
Mhm.
finally allowed some things to release that I had been sort of holding in for a really long time.
Right, and holding things in like that really doesn't do you much good, to your physical health as well as your mental health.
Right. And I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der
Mm.
Kolk. If you haven't read that one, any of your listeners haven't read it, it was incredibly helpful for me to read that, because it helped me finally reconnect with my body. A lot of
Mm.
survivors of sexual trauma dissociate from their bodies and disconnect from their bodies. And I did not realize how much the trauma had impacted me physically. And I was definitely storing trauma in lots of different ways. And it came down to my posture, the way that I held myself. I started doing CrossFit around that same time, and
Mhm.
I was lifting weights. And, my coaches who were in the gym with me would say, you're really tight in your lower back. Your hips are really tight. You're not really getting as low as you need to when you're lifting. And all of that was related to where I was storing the trauma. So then I started exploring even more healing modalities, and I discovered somatic workouts and things like that.
Mhm.
So I've been through a lot of different ways to try and heal all the different parts of me that were affected by all the trauma.
Have you ever tried Feldenkrais?
I haven't, but it's one of the things I'd like to try. I'd like to look into it.
Oh, it's wonderful. I'm actually a Feldenkrais practitioner.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and, it's an amazing modality. It changed my life completely. Had when I first started the training, I had had a traumatic experience, and going through that training, I mean, it was a little scary at first, but it was just so incredibly liberating, and you could just feel everything falling away and falling off of you. It's just amazing, amazing work. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I will definitely give it a try.
Okay. So now when you were going through this process over that summer, were you still married?
I no, I got divorced by the time that I started the intensive outpatient
Mhm.
therapy. And
Okay.
so we had split kids custody 50-50. And so they were with me a week on and a week off.
Mhm.
And I just told I only had 3 kids remaining at home at this time. And
Mhm.
I just told them, I've got therapy from 9 to noon today. And so you guys are going to have to entertain yourselves for a little while. And while I go through this, and I would just close my door, and they knew I was there for emergencies, obviously, but they were really good
Mhm.
about just understanding that it was something I needed to do.
Mhm. Do your children know what happened to you?
Yes. My youngest daughter, we've only really kind of talked generally about it. I didn't want to give her a whole lot of details yet. I don't think she's quite ready for that. But and she hasn't read my book, but my older children, we have talked pretty extensively about the different kinds of trauma that I've been through. And you know, it really, all of that evolved out of a conversation of me saying, you know, I came to my kids a few years ago and said, I'm going to start talking about the things that I went through as a child, and I want you guys to know about it so that you're not sort of blindsided by what happened. And especially with my older children, I have 2 daughters who are married, and, you know, talking with them about their marital relationship, it's been really helpful for me to talk to them about the kind of spouse that I was and why I stayed in that relationship so long. And it's been really helpful and healing for my older kids to sort of understand, okay, the reason why XYZ happened, or the reason why you acted in this way, was because of this in your relationship, and all of those kinds of things. It's really helpful, I think, for them to understand their childhoods as well.
Were they angry when they heard your story?
I don't really know if anger was what came up for them. One of my children was really angry when I decided to get divorced, because I think they didn't understand. Our relationship toward the later years of my marriage was pretty even tempered. And all of the disagreements that we had were behind closed doors, and all of the sort of unhealthy things about the relationship were not things that my children would have known about or understood at that time. I tried really hard to protect them from the unhealthy dynamics and to not let them know what was really happening. And so I think that they were somewhat blindsided by, at least the younger ones were somewhat blindsided by the divorce. As far as anger about what I went through, I don't know that anger necessarily came up, but each of them in their own way has sort of expressed, you know, their sorrow that I went through it, their empathy that I went through it, and they've been very understanding of the fact that I was not the kind of mom that I wanted to be or could be because of the trauma that I went through. Until I started really healing, there were ways in which I couldn't and didn't show up for them. And it's an ongoing conversation that we have. I have a lot of grief about the time that I lost, not being able to be the kind of mother that I wanted to be. And I also have a lot of grief for what I must have put them through because of my unhealth at that time. And so, you know, it's an ongoing conversation. You know, I just realized the other day that I didn't show up for you in this way, and I wish that I would have handled that differently. We have those conversations a lot.
Wow, that's incredibly healing in itself. And
It is for me. I hope it is for them too.
Well, it's so much healthier than suppressing it.
Yeah. And I also feel like it became very important to me to, at an early age, even before my healing started, to apologize to my children for mistakes that I made, and to help them know that I wasn't infallible, because I wanted it to be safe for them to make mistakes too. And I wanted them to feel comfortable coming to me when something went wrong and having a conversation about it. And I didn't want them to be afraid to talk to me about it.
And you were talking about wanting to protect them from hearing some of the things. You were protecting them from your past until you felt that they were old enough and able to understand it. So while we're on the topic of protection, I'm sure that as you had your children and they were growing up, you must have been, and still probably are, incredibly protective and almost overly protective, because you know what's out there.
Yeah, I'm very protective. I'm a big believer in giving my kids as much information as I can for them to protect themselves. I've tried to be, because my parents were protective, I think, in an unhealthy way. They tried to shield us from things by just not allowing us to have experiences.
Mhm.
And I didn't want to do that with my kids. I wanted them to be able to experience things for themselves. And so I tried to get into a modality of teaching them about potential harmful things and then allowing them to go out in the world armed with some information already. And I have to admit, you know, as a parent, I think for me, that's one of the most difficult things is knowing that I can't protect my children from every harm that's out
Mhm.
there. And my kids did suffer, you know, abuses of some kind and harms of some kind that I had no idea about. You know, even
Mhm.
with the things that I was able to teach them, you can't prepare for every single eventuality that there is. But I also know that my kids know that they have a safe place to land with me, that when
Mhm.
something awful does happen, that I'm here for them 100%. And the
Mhm.
flip side of that coin is that it's really painful to watch your kids go through those things. But when they have a safe place to land, it's
Mhm.
easier for them to come out of it with some positive knowledge and some added strength, and
Mhm.
you know, to try and see where those difficult experiences have taught them things.
Mhm.
And it's a hard thing as a parent to watch your kids suffer in any way, you know,
Mhm.
and we always think, oh, I should have protected them. And even my parents, you know, they know about the babysitter situation, and they're of course horrified that they didn't know what was going on. But
Mhm.
we as parents, even the healthiest parents, can't protect their children from
Mhm.
everything.
Mhm. Going back to that babysitter and that situation, I mean, it is so horrific that that was going on. And obviously it went on for years. And, you know, you, of course, weren't the only child.
Right.
And that they got away with it, like, right underneath everybody's noses. I mean, you know, that nobody suspected. And I
Right.
mean, the parents, once they found out, must have been just absolutely horrified. It just goes to demonstrate how prevalent and how insidious abuse and trafficking is. When people think of trafficking, they think of the white van, throw the, you know, person, the woman, the kid in the car, and they take off. But it's so insidious and it's everywhere. So how do we protect our children, educate our children, and let them know what the signs are of either grooming or that something's not right, and what steps do they take? Because I think that's so important.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for what you said. And thank you for this question, because this is one of the things I'm most passionate about talking about,
Mhm.
is that we sort of protect ourselves from the harsh reality of trafficking by thinking it happens somewhere else, and by thinking the kids get snatched and taken somewhere else. But the reality is that the majority of trafficking victims are trafficked by people that they know, by relatives and by close family friends.
Mhm.
And so I'm glad that you brought up grooming, because that is exactly how it happened to me, and how it happens most often is that an adult will gradually get close to a child and make them feel comfortable, make them feel safe, maybe give them gifts, or maybe even just talk to them in a way that they're not used to being talked to. And
Mhm.
so for me, coming from an emotionally neglectful family of origin, if anybody paid attention to me and made me feel special, I immediately was drawn to that and wanted more of that, because I wasn't getting that at home.
Mhm.
And so a lot of what we can do to protect our children, first of all, is to make sure that they feel safe and loved in our own home. You know, make
Mhm.
sure that their emotional needs are being met in our home. And if they have physical needs that we can't meet, that we get resources to try and get that done. And because I was so young, you know, when 7 years old is that age for children developmentally where they're learning who they are as an individual. And they learn that from the adults in their lives, whether it be parents or teachers or coaches or pastors or whomever it is. And it's an especially vulnerable age where if an adult tells a young child something about themselves, the child believes it. And
Mhm.
so what my abuser said to me, told me, was that my only value was in what I could offer sexually. And he told me that this is the way that all young girls are valuable, and that this is what everybody does. And it was my responsibility to make sure that whomever I interacted with was getting what they wanted and needed. And so it created a pattern in my life where I felt like I wasn't allowed to speak up and say no when something was happening that I didn't want to happen. And that's where some of that dissociation and shutting down came from. So as parents, protecting ourselves from grooming is having those frequent conversations with our kids about the adults in their lives, and also having face-to-face contact with the adults who spend time with our children. It's
Mhm.
really easy nowadays to just shoot a text to a mom and say,
Mhm.
hey, my daughter said that your daughter invited them over for a sleepover. Is that okay with you? Shooting a text is really easy to do. It's easy to just pull up and drop the kid off and see you later. But it is so important for us to walk up to the door, to have a face-to-face conversation with that person, to sort of read their energy. How do they come off? Do they seem like they are a kind person? Do they seem
Mhm.
harsh? Do they seem overbearing? All of these kinds of things are information for us to take in. And
Mhm.
when we have those one-on-one conversations with the adults, I actually watched an interview with a pedophile who had been convicted. And a journalist was interviewing them and saying, how did you choose your victims? And one of the things that he said was, I purposefully chose children who didn't have a strong father figure in their lives.
Mm.
And then he went on to say, sometimes it wasn't even that they didn't have a father figure, but they didn't have anybody that I perceived to be a threat. And
Mm.
so we as parents can be a threat to predators just by being present and just by
Mhm.
showing up, and by not allowing our kids to have private one-on-one interviews with ecclesiastical leaders, or not
Mhm.
allowing them to have one-on-one auditions with coaches, and
Mhm.
not allowing them to be alone in the room with another adult that we don't know or that we haven't had a one-on-one conversation with. And even the adults that we do know, those things should be limited to the times when it's absolutely necessary. And I would submit that there really aren't any times that it's absolutely necessary for your kid to be alone in the room with another adult without you having some kind of supervision there. So it's a big job, especially in the internet age.
Mhm.
Electronics and the internet come into play with trafficking and grooming all the time. So we need to be in our kids' phones. They don't need to have passwords that we don't know. And
Mhm.
they don't need to have their social media accounts set to public. They should be
Mhm.
set to private. And their message requests should have to come through you. You
Mhm.
should have to approve the request of whoever they're speaking to privately in their direct messages. And when my kids were really young, I think they're allowed to have Facebook, Instagram, things like that once they're 13. But when they're 13, they're still too young to be messaging people privately on those apps.
Mhm.
So yes, it's a big job, but it's one of those things where your kids want to be able to interact online. Of course, that's how most kids communicate with each other these days, even text messages and things like that. But if they know that at some point you're going to sit down with them during the week and go through those messages and say, who are you talking to? How are these messages making you feel? Is there anybody who's talking to you in a way that doesn't feel good to you?
Mhm.
And those kinds of things. So yeah, whenever I talk about this, it feels like an overwhelming job, even for me to do with the two kids that I still have at home, much less,
Mhm.
my older kids.
Mhm.
But it is the job of parenting in this day and age, if we really want to protect our kids from the most prevalent form of trafficking, which happens online, indirect messages, people soliciting nude photographs and things like that. That's really one of the main ways that it happens nowadays.
Oh my goodness, I can't even begin to imagine. I mean, I grew up, in a time, I'm a baby boomer, so I grew up in a much different time that, I to this day, I still miss the rotary phone. But, I couldn't imagine. And I know um, how my parents were very active in the community and even in our neighborhood. It was almost like you didn't have one set of parents looking out for you. There was like a circle, there was a ring, and everybody looked out for everybody else's as kids at the same time. And every single day, and I have 4 sisters, so there are 5 of us. So yeah, and my father was incredibly threatening, just so you know. He had a black belt in karate. He was a big guy. He was Eastern European, and pretty much nobody dated us. We didn't date in high school at all because everybody knew who my dad was and what he could do. So I had to move out to Colorado to get a date. But anyhow, it was a much different time.
Yeah.
And it was almost like if there was somebody in the neighborhood or somebody that, was a little off or kind of funny, it was like, stay away from them. And then every day that we would come home from school, my mom would sit down and say, who did you talk to today? What did you do? Blah, blah, blah. And of course, she was just being interested, but you can tell she was, collecting data at the same time.
Right. Right. And I do think that we miss that community of adults who are watching out for our kids. And it's even when you do have a community of close friends and things, we're all so busy with everything these days that we don't take the time to sit down and talk to people as much as used to happen, and it's a little bit sad, but it's the reality of the world that we live in. But there are still ways that we can check in with other people. And I was really fortunate to work at the school that my kids went to when they were in high school. And so, I knew all of their teachers, and all of the teachers and administrators knew to look out for my kids, because I would go to all of those teachers before the school year started in person, introduce myself and say, hey, I'm just over here in this other building if you ever need anything. And, hey, I don't think that that's necessarily going too far for parents to do that nowadays. A lot of times parents don't show up to the open house. They don't meet the teacher face to face. The only time they have an interaction with the teacher is if there is some kind of discipline problem or some kind of a grade problem, and then it's usually via email. I think it's a great idea for parents to go into the school and face to face say, hey, just wanted you to put a face with the name. I'm here for my kid. Watch out for them. Let me know if you see anything strange, those kinds of things. And to do the same thing within our church communities, in the sports communities, wherever our kids have time that they're spending with other adults and with other children. The more connections that we make with those other parents and those other adults, the more we can watch out for each other's kids and be there for them.
Well, you talked about that, we're so busy these days, and there's so much going on, and there's so many distractions. And I think that's another thing that makes all of us more vulnerable to predators. We're distracted with our phones. I see people, women especially, it drives me crazy, women and kids walking around in public with their cell phone in their hands, and they're looking at their phone. I see people walking their dogs and they're looking at their phone. They have no idea who's watching them.
Yeah, exactly. And that it is scary, because a lot of what we're taught as women is to be vigilant, and to, if we constantly have our eyes up and our head on a swivel, predators are going to choose someone else who's not paying attention. One of the best things that I ever did for myself was to turn off the push notifications on my phone, because I have shifted from my phone being a source of entertainment and a distraction and something to occupy me when I'm bored, to I've shifted that focus to my phone as a utility. It is here for me to use to make my life easier. And when I am expecting a text, if I'm away from my children, I'm going to turn on the push notifications and the ringer for my text so that I know if my kids need something. They're the most important people in my life, and everybody else can wait. Every other single app that's on my phone, I don't need to be paying attention to that when I'm out in public or when I'm having conversations with other adults. If I'm watching my kid in a football game, my phone is away. I don't need to be distracted by that while I'm focusing on watching my kid and interacting with the other parents. It's so easy to, go to a dance recital, sit in the back row and scroll on your phone until the performance starts and then pick up your kid and leave. A better way to show up as a parent and protect our kids is to put that phone away and go talk to the other adults who are also involved in that dance studio and taking lessons from those same instructors. That's the time and place where parents say, something happened the other day that I felt a little off about. Have you guys ever experienced this with this coach or this teacher or this pastor or this parent? It's the place where we can exchange that valuable information about what's truly happening with our children and the adults in their lives.
The power of communication. And that could keep a lot of kids safe.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And put down the phone. Honestly, that drives me crazy. I think that whoever, invented the iPhone, who was it? Was it Jobs? I don't know. But whoever invented the iPhone was a predator.
Possible.
Because it makes us so much more vulnerable. It is a great tool, but makes us so vulnerable. So please, everybody, turn off the notifications. I always have my phone on silent. When I'm driving, it's always on silent. Of course, I don't have anybody who's really, I don't think, going to try and get a hold of me in an emergency. Don't have young kids. When my parents were sick was the only time that I had it on because I knew they might need me.
Yeah. And I have to admit that, I got sucked into, the whole social media thing for quite a long time. I was on Facebook a lot. And I just gradually got to the point where I started realizing that the people I was in front of were more important than the people who were online. And it actually took me being called out by my partner. And he said, we were driving somewhere and I was scrolling through Instagram and he was like, we were having a conversation, but I was kind of scrolling while we were talking. It wasn't super consequential. It was, I don't know, about the weather or something like that. And I started to get messages on Instagram, people sending me reels or things that they wanted me to see or whatever. And every time somebody sent a message, I would pick up my phone and look at it. And he said to me at one point, I just feel like you're so distracted when we talk that it's hard for me to connect with you. And I went, oh.
Yeah.
And it was truly, the messages I was receiving were truly inconsequential. They were just friends reaching out to say, hey, I thought this was funny, or hey, this resonated with me, or hey, isn't this just like us? Which, yeah, it's fun to get those messages and have those connections with my friends online, but those things are inconsequential compared to being in the presence of the person that I love most in the world. And if they feel like I'm not connecting with them, that was when I decided to turn off my push notifications and say, I'm going to prioritize the live human beings in my life. And my phone is for the times when I'm alone, when I'm sitting in a waiting room, when I don't need to be really present for the people that I'm in front of.
Okay, so we talked about being present in relationships. While we're on that subject, how do you get out of toxic relationships, abusive relationships? How do you find the exit?
I have to say that universally, all of the toxic systems or relationships that I have left, they all had there was one thing in common that allowed me to get out, and it was taking a break. And I know that seems kind of like a silly thing to say, but I didn't realize how unhealthy my family of origin was until I left for college. I didn't realize how unhealthy my marriage was until I had to be away from my spouse for 2 weeks. And I was around other people. Because it was very much a coercive control relationship where I wasn't really allowed to have friends and I wasn't really allowed to have community outside of the relationship. And so it wasn't until I got outside of the relationship, outside of his influence and control for 2 weeks straight that I went, oh my gosh, there's some things happening here that aren't normal. And during the pandemic, when we weren't meeting in church in public, was when I realized how toxic my religion was. So
Wow.
they all had this thing in common where I was so immersed in the relationship or in the system. My teaching job as well, the same thing happened during the pandemic when I wasn't in the classroom and we were being asked to do more and more and more with less and less and less. And I was being forced to make a decision between doing what was best for my children and their physical health, or
Mhm.
doing what was best for the school district and what they were asking of me. So it always came to these like critical points where I'd had some time away to reflect on, is this healthy for me? Is this
Mhm.
right for me? If I was choosing this now today in my healed state, is it something I would choose for my life? And the answer always came up as no, this is not healthy for me. This is not
Mhm.
what I want my life to look like. I'm going to choose to do what is best for me and prioritize that above everything else, even above my children. Because
Mhm.
when we as mothers don't take the time to heal ourselves and to do for ourselves what needs to get done, we cannot show up as the kind of parent that we need to be for our children. We can't show up as the kind of partner that we want to be in our primary relationships. So even though I, as a child, was programmed to believe that taking time for myself was selfish,
Mhm.
the whole reason that I wrote that second book about self-care is because prioritizing yourself and your emotional needs has to come before you can show up for anybody else in a meaningful way. And learning how to sit with your own uncomfortable emotions allows you to show up for other people who are experiencing uncomfortable emotions. If you haven't healed your own trauma, you
Mhm.
can't show up for someone else experiencing trauma. And
Mhm.
me as a mother, I could not have conversations with my children about healthy relationships and healthy sexuality because
Mhm.
I hadn't healed my own trauma in those two areas either. So taking care of ourselves and prioritizing our mental health and our needs is the only way that we can really show up for the other people in our lives.
It seems like these days there is an awful lot of mental health issues. And I find it fascinating because we're a lot more open about talking about mental health. Years ago, it was something that we just swept under the rug and wouldn't talk about. But
Mhm.
there are so many people who are suffering in ways that are unimaginable. I never knew that, mental health disorders could be so pervasive. I mean, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I talk about in my first book. And one of the theories that I have, and obviously I'm not a mental health professional, but when I think about my own family, and I think about my great grandfather, who was a World War II flying ace, whose plane went down behind enemy lines, and he
Wow.
was in a concentration camp for several months.
Oh.
When he escaped, he and his friends were starving to death, and they found an open rail car that was filled with food that had been abandoned. And his friends literally ate themselves to death because they had been starving. And he was the only one that made it out of that.
Oh.
But he never talked about that to anybody except in very closed circles. So, did he have trauma? Absolutely. Did he get it healed? Nope. Did he pass it on? Yep. So, therefore, did my parents experience trauma? Absolutely, 100%. Did they heal from it? No, because they're in your generation, the generation that didn't talk about mental health issues,
Mhm.
the generation where therapy was not widely available. We didn't have all
Mhm.
these modalities that we have now.
Mhm.
Mental health medication was not widely available, and it was stigmatized, and it had harmful side effects worse than the medications that are available to us now. And the way that my parents dealt with their trauma was to just pray harder, be more faithful, work
Mhm.
harder, just put your head down and suck it up and get through it.
Mhm.
And so, did they pass trauma on to their children? 100%. That's why my growing up environment was emotionally neglectful. That's why my parents weren't able to connect with me and show up for me in ways that were healthy for me. That's why this got passed on. So if I hadn't taken the time to heal from the trauma that I went through, I know that I passed some of my trauma down to my older children because I wasn't healed as a young mother.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the other interesting thing. We talked earlier about your body storing trauma.
Mm-hmm.
My mother, who experienced trauma, when she got pregnant with me and I was formed in her womb, the eggs of my children were also formed at the same time. So the trauma she stored in her body got passed down to my children, regardless of what I did.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got pregnant with my oldest daughter and was experiencing trauma, the eggs of her children got formed in my womb at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, her children are going to have some of that, regardless of what any of us do. And that's my theory about why why mental health issues are so widespread nowadays, is because of generational cycles of trauma. And all of us are going to, at some point in our life, have some kind of unmet emotional need. And so really my theory is that all of us need therapy on some level, because we need to find ways to relate with people in healthy ways. And that doesn't come born innately in us. What comes born innately in us is to survive at all costs. And when we experience trauma, our brain goes back to that survival instinct. And the instinct is for us to close off, to shut down, and to protect ourselves at all costs. And a lot of times protecting ourselves means treating the other people in our lives as if they are a threat. And so the cycle continues over and over. And so my message to everybody in the world is, therapeutic help is not just for people who've experienced trauma. Therapeutic help is for everybody who wants to have healthier connections with the people in their lives. And when I think about what is most important to human beings on this planet, the most important thing that we have in our life is the connections that we have with the people that we love and care about. Because rich or poor, no matter where we come from in the world, there is nothing more valuable than human connection. And the only way we can do that in healthy and meaningful ways is to learn how.
So you teach people how to do that?
I do, yes.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about that.
So I became a coach mainly to help people learn how to heal their relationships. And what I start with is trying to help people learn to heal their relationship with themselves, because you cannot reach outward for connection until you've first reached inward for healing. And that's kind of what we've been talking about this whole time. So I'm not a therapist, I'm not licensed, but I do have a lot of life experience, and I have a lot of resources that I can plug people into. And so my job as a coach is just to listen to people's experiences and to help them from an outsider's perspective, point out the ways in their life in which they might be deficient in making those connections with themselves and with other people. So again, it's not therapy, but it is sort of a reframing, helping people think about things in different ways, and then plugging them into resources that can help them achieve what it is they're looking for in their lives. So
how can people get a hold of you, Megan? How can they find you?
I have a website. It's third-verse.com. And I think of it like my childhood was my first verse and my marriage was my second verse. And this part of my life is my third verse. And finally, I'm the one who gets to write it.
Nice.
So all of my social media contacts are there. My coaching information is there. Links to purchasing my books are there. And you can actually download a free chapter of my book, I Walked Through Fire to Get Here, there. So you can read it and see if it's something you're interested in actually buying. And then I also have a free how to hire a therapist guide on the website that people can download for free. And it just sort of walks you through the questions you need to ask a potential mental health, coach or therapist in order to get the kind of help that's competent, that's really going to serve you well.
Well, that's pretty valuable to have.
I think so. I had a hard time finding a therapist
Mhm,
that was competent. I went through several that were not helpful,
mhm,
and I didn't know anything about how to choose a good therapist, and I wasted a lot of time and money working with people that
mhm.
just were never going to be able to help me. There are also a lot of therapists out there in the mental health field who haven't done their own therapeutic work.
Oh,
And I think it's really important for people to find somebody who have done that work so that they can, you can't help somebody be introspective about, the deepest parts of ourselves if we haven't explored that on our own. So you
mhm,
want a therapist who's done that work. And it is a job interview because you're hiring
mhm,
somebody for the job of protecting your mental health. And
mhm.
so that guide is up there for exactly that reason.
Mhm. Very good. I actually tried therapy and it just didn't resonate with me. Let's just put it to you that way. One woman I tried and I think I went to her twice. I could not stand being in the same room with her. So I thought, well, there's a red flag. And then I tried somebody else. It was like he kept triggering me and I'm going, why am I doing this? And then I started martial arts and it was like, ah, I feel better now.
Yeah. It's interesting what, different modalities are going to work for different people. And, when I say that therapy is universally something that we all need, I'm
Mhm,
not just talking about sitting down with somebody while they take notes. That's not
mhm,
necessarily what's going to work for
mhm,
everybody, but going out there and finding what does work, and for
mhm,
you, obviously it was martial arts. For
mhm,
me, part of my healing was weightlifting. It's going to
mhm.
be different
Power.
for everybody.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it was so uncomfortable for me to have to sit still and talk to somebody because I'm a mover, and that's why I think martial arts resonated so much with me. It took a while, but
Mhm.
that resonated with me, and at the same time, I had started my Feldenkrais training too. So 2 incredibly different but somewhat related, movement modalities, and for me, that's what really helped. So, anybody I'm encouraging the listeners, or if you know anybody who might be looking for someone, there are a lot of different modalities that you can try, and not one thing does not work for everyone. So I would not suggest that you go out and do what I did and start training in martial arts unless it really speaks to you. But there are so many things that you can do, and do not give up, because if you try something and it doesn't work, stop. There's always something else.
Yes, and not only that, but I started with talk therapy, but that
Mm,
only took me so far. And then
mhm,
I did EMDR therapy, and that only took me so far.
mhm,
It was both of those things were incredibly helpful and incredibly healing for me, but I had to go out and explore a number of different things, and it's something I'm still working on. I'm still working through the physicality of trauma. And I still
mhm,
occasionally check in with my therapist about things because some things will come up and I'm like, I don't understand why this is bothering me so much. And it takes a little while of getting through that with my different people that I talk to, whether it's a therapist or a coach or whatever, before I make the connection that goes, oh, okay, this bothers me because of X that happened. And so that's
mhm,
what I need to work on next.
mhm. And
So,
I've heard people always say it's like peeling an onion.
yep,
But I
100%.
don't like that analogy, because when you're peeling an onion, there's always another layer, and every layer makes you cry. I like to think of it as peeling an artichoke, because when you have an artichoke, that's all prickly and thick, and you start peeling those outer leaves, and then it starts getting a little bit softer and more tender until finally you get to the heart. So
Mhm.
I prefer thinking of an artichoke.
I like that too, because even with the prickly parts, there are those little bits that you can savor at the
Right.
end with
Right.
every part that you take off. Yeah, I like that better
Exactly.
than an onion too. That's great.
Yeah. Okay, so Megan, do you have any final pearls of wisdom, something that you would like to leave the audience with to really think about, maybe even action steps or whatever?
Well, my main message all the time is that healing is possible. And
Mm,
I want people to understand that no matter how difficult your circumstances are, no matter what you've been through, it is possible to heal and to thrive afterwards. And one of my favorite quotes is by Rilke, who is a German poet. And he said, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror.
mm,
No feeling is final. Just keep going. And that's sort of what I live my life by, because no matter what it is that we're feeling, whether it's good or bad, it's going to pass. And we have to learn to savor the moments in our lives, whether they're good or bad, because the good moments don't last and the bad moments don't last either. And the bad moments sometimes are the things that help us to transform and help to teach us so that we can go on. And for me, the most important part of my healing is knowing that what I went through helps me to connect with people in a very unique way. It's really difficult for non-trauma survivors to connect with trauma survivors. And so I'm grateful for the experiences that I went through, because it allows me a level of connection that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And my very favorite thing to do, and the way that I feel the best in the world, is to connect with other survivors and to help them see that they have everything inside themselves that they need in order to heal. And we all do. We all have that inside of us.
Excellent. That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Megan, for being on the show and sharing your story. What a powerful story. And I'm sorry for everything that you've gone through, but I'm so proud of you to see where you are now and how you're helping other people.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'd love to be on your show.
Oh, thanks. And everybody, wow, what a story. Thank you so much for listening. Please share this episode with everyone you know. Whether or not they have children, it doesn't matter. This is such an important message, how we can protect our kids, protect each other, to be aware, to be vigilant, and to make sure that, we all take care of not only ourselves physically, but emotionally, and protecting our mental health. Because if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.